Vladimir Putin thought he had seen everything the West could possibly throw at him. He thought his forces had adapted to the high-tech, precision-guided nightmare that the modern battlefield has become. He calculated the risks of the HIMARS. He braced for the Bradley fighting vehicles. He watched his armored columns get chewed to pieces by FPV drones. But just when the Kremlin thought they had mapped out the entire Ukrainian arsenal, the earth in the Donbass began to shake with a violently unfamiliar rhythm. The ground trembled, the sky tore open, and Russian soldiers in their fortified trenches realized they were no longer just fighting a modern war of drones and lasers. They had just been introduced to an apex predator born in the fires of the Cold War. The United States of America built one of the most terrifyingly powerful conventional weapons in human history decades ago, and without any warning, without any flashy press conferences or grand political announcements, Ukraine has casually unleashed it on the front lines. The Russian military is being crushed, pulverized, and completely demoralized by a weapon they had absolutely no idea was coming. This is the story of the heavy hitter, the bunker buster, the undisputed titan of the battlefield. The weapon in question is the M100 203mm self-propelled howitzer, and what it is doing to the Russian spring offensive is nothing short of catastrophic. To understand why this weapon is causing outright panic among Russian commanders, you have to understand exactly what it is. The M100 is not a surgical scalpel. It is not designed to politely tap a target from the sky. It is a weapon of absolute unfiltered destruction. For decades, the United States military relied on the M100 as its heavy artillery champion. We are talking about a gun so massive, so incredibly over-engineered, that it was originally designed to fire tactical nuclear artillery shells. That is the pedigree of the machine Ukraine just got its hands on. And while Ukraine isn't firing nuclear rounds, the conventional high explosives they are dropping on Russian positions are enough to vaporize fortified bunkers, flip 60-ton main battle tanks like children's toys, and turn coordinated infantry assaults into absolute dust. The arrival of this beast was confirmed without any fanfare. The 52nd Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces simply dropped a post on social media on April 2nd, casually listing their inventory. They mentioned their domestically made Bodna howitzers. They mentioned their RM-70 Vampire rocket systems. And right there, tacked onto the end of the list almost like an afterthought, they casually dropped the fact that they are now operating the 203mm M110. They made it sound routine. It is anything but routine. The sudden appearance of an 8-inch American artillery gun on the European battlefield changes the entire mathematics of this war. And to understand how this happened, we have to trace the incredible geopolitical chess match that brought this retired American monster out of the history books and straight into the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century. How did Ukraine get an officially retired Cold War-era heavy artillery piece? You would think it would be impossible. The United States military officially phased the M110 out of active service back in the 1990s, shifting entirely to the 155mm M109 Paladin for its self-propelled artillery needs. But just because a weapon is retired by the United States does not mean it is obsolete. It just means the American military doctrine evolved. But the raw kinetic power of the M110 never faded. The trail of these specific weapons leads directly to a massive, highly lucrative, and utterly brilliant deal brokered in secret. It traces back to the sprawling military warehouses of Greece. The Greek armed forces had operated the M110 since the early 1980s. For decades, it was their ultimate long-range insurance policy. But as Greece modernized to standard NATO 155mm systems, they found themselves with a massive stockpile of these 203mm behemoths just sitting in storage, collecting dust. Ukraine saw an opportunity that would change the war. Through a deal facilitated by the Czech Republic, Greece approved the transfer of 60 of these devastating artillery systems directly to the Ukrainian front lines. But the guns themselves were only half the story. A gun without ammunition is just an expensive tractor, and this is where the deal goes from good to absolutely legendary. Along with the 60 M110s, Greece transferred a staggering 150,000 rounds of 203mm ammunition. The total value of this deal was estimated at under $230 million. On paper, it might look like Greece was offloading old junk for a massive payday. But the reality is the exact opposite. Ukraine executed the military bargain of the century. Let's break down the sheer terrifying geometry of what those 150,000 shells actually are, because this is where the nightmare begins for the Russian infantry. We are not talking about standard artillery rounds. Every single time the M1-110 fires, it hurls a projectile that weighs roughly 198 pounds. Think about that. That is the weight of a fully grown man packed with military-grade high explosives, flying through the air at supersonic speeds and slamming into the earth with the kinetic energy of a meteor. Out of that massive stockpile, 50,000 of these rounds are M106 high explosive fragmentation shells. When one of these hits the ground, it creates a crater deep enough to bury a car. The shockwave alone is enough to rupture internal organs from yards away, and the jagged steel shrapnel cuts through trees, trenches, and light armor like a chainsaw through wet paper. But it gets worse for the Russians. 40,000 of the rounds transferred are M650 rocket-assisted projectiles. This means that after the massive shell leaves the barrel of the gun, a rocket motor ignites in mid-air, propelling that 200-pound bomb out to a range of almost 19 miles. 30 kilometers of reach. This allows Ukrainian artillery crews to sit safely behind their own lines, completely out of range of standard Russian counter-battery fire, and drop catastrophic payloads directly onto Russian command centers, ammunition dumps, and logistics hubs hidden deep in the rear. And if that wasn't enough, Ukraine also received 60,000 rounds of specialized submunition shells, including 30,000 M509 dual-purpose cluster munitions. When an M110 fires a cluster round over a Russian staging area, the shell doesn't hit the ground. It cracks open in the sky, raining down dozens of smaller, highly lethal bomblets over an area the size of a football field. For a Russian commander trying to assemble a mechanized assault column, the M110 cluster strike is a localized apocalypse. It shreds tires, tracks, engine blocks, and human flesh in a matter of seconds. There is no armor thick enough on the top of a Russian tank to survive a direct hit from a top-down submunition delivered by an 8-inch gun. So why does this specific weapon matter so much right now? Why is it a game changer when Ukraine already has modern Western artillery like the HIMARS, the Caesar, and the Panzerhaubitze? It comes down to the brutal, gritty reality of the war Putin has chosen to fight. This conflict has devolved into a gruesome time capsule. It does not look like a modern 21st century war. It looks like the trenches of World War I combined with the armor clashes of World War II, but with drones watching from above. Russia relies on meat assaults. They send wave after wave of expendable infantry and outdated tanks to slowly grind down Ukrainian defenses through sheer mass. Against this archaic brute force tactic, the high-tech precision weapons of the West are sometimes too delicate or too expensive to waste on a muddy trench filled with conscripts. The M1-110 is the perfect counter to Russia's strategy because it matches brute force with overwhelming, world-ending brute force. The 52nd Artillery Brigade has integrated this Cold War titan into a brilliant layered doctrine. Think of it like a lethal orchestra. The brigade already operates the RM-70 Vampire rocket launcher. The Vampire is their shotgun. It fires massive barrages of rockets to sweep wide areas and tear apart the initial waves of a Russian infantry assault. Next, they have the domestically built Bodana howitzer. The Bodana is their sniper rifle. It reaches deep into the back lines with pinpoint accuracy to take out specific high-value targets like radar stations and fuel depots. But until now, they were missing the sledgehammer. They were missing the weapon you call upon when you need to completely erase a reinforced concrete bunker, or utterly dismantle a hardened Russian stronghold that rockets and lighter artillery simply cannot crack. Enter the M110. It is the sledgehammer. With its tracked chassis and massive 405 horsepower engine, this beast can roll through the thickest Ukrainian mud, set up its firing position, drop a 200-pound nightmare onto a Russian bunker, and then spool up its engine and relocate before Russian radar can even calculate where the shot came from. Yes, it requires a massive crew. 13 men are required to operate this system at peak efficiency. 5 men drive and operate the main gun vehicle, while the rest follow closely behind in a dedicated armored cargo carrier hauling those massive shells. Yes, it is slow to fire. Hauling a 200-pound shell into the breach is back-breaking work, meaning the M110 typically fires only 1 round every 2 minutes. But when you are firing an 8-inch shell, you don't need to fire fast. You just need to fire accurately, because whatever that shell touches ceases to exist. 1 round every 2 minutes is more than enough when a single round can level a city block. The economics of this weapon are just as devastating to Russia as the high explosives. Warfare is ultimately a contest of mathematics and money. The West has been supplying Ukraine with incredible technology, but that technology comes at an astronomical price. Excalibur guided artillery shells cost over $100,000 each. A single GMLRS rocket fired from a HIMARS costs over $160,000. When you are fighting a war of attrition against a massive country like Russia, you cannot afford to drop a $100,000 bomb on a cluster of infantry worth nothing more to Putin than the cheap uniforms they are wearing. This is where the Greek M110 deal proves to be an absolute masterstroke of military accounting. When you divide the total cost of the $230 million deal by the 150,000 shells, taking into account the price of the 60 actual howitzers themselves, the math is staggering. Ukraine is paying less than $1,300 per shell. Let that sink in. For $1,300, Ukraine can unleash a blast radius that will completely vaporize a multi-million-dollar Russian T-90 tank. For $1,300, they can wipe out an entire platoon of advancing Russian soldiers. Every time the M110 fires, it represents an astronomical return on investment. The weapon pays for itself with a single pull of the lanyard. In a war where Ukraine is constantly fighting to stretch its financial aid, keeping costs low while maximizing physical destruction is the holy grail of military strategy. The M110 delivers exactly that. Right now, the heavy breathing of these machines is being felt in the most critical sectors of the entire war. The 52nd Artillery Brigade has deployed these Titans to the Eastern Front, specifically operating in the brutal meat grinders of the Kharkiv and Kramatorsk sectors. Kramatorsk is the crown jewel of the Donbass. It is one of the 4 heavily fortified cities that make up the Donetsk fortress belt. This 50-kilometer stretch of interconnected defenses, trenches, and concrete bunkers stands directly in the way of Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal. If Kramatorsk falls, the entire Donbass is completely vulnerable. Ukraine has spent the last 10 years fortifying this exact strip of land. It is a labyrinth of death for any invading force. And now the Russian military doesn't just have to navigate minefields, drone swarms, and machine gun nests. Now anytime Russian commanders try to mass their armor for a breakthrough, anytime they try to gather a battalion of troops in the tree lines to prepare for a charge, the sky screams. The M1110 reaches out from behind the fortress walls and crushes them before they can even chamber a round. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Artillery has always been the greatest killer on the battlefield, causing over 80% of all casualties in this war. But there is a massive psychological difference between the sharp, sudden crack of a 155mm shell and the earth-shattering, bowel-loosening roar of a 203mm impact. It shatters the morale of the Russian infantry. It creates a paralyzing fear that there is no bunker deep enough, no armor thick enough to save them. And Ukraine is weaponizing the landscape itself to maximize this slaughter. Ukraine has spent months engineering massive, intricate kill zones along the front lines. These are vast stretches of no man's land deliberately seeded with anti-tank ditches, thousands of landmines, miles of razor wire, and concrete dragon's teeth. These obstacles are not just meant to stop the Russians, they are meant to steer them. By creating impenetrable barriers, Ukrainian engineers force the advancing Russian columns to turn and move through pre-calculated corridors. They funnel the Russian armor into wide-open, perfectly mapped-out firing ranges. Imagine being a Russian tank commander. You are ordered to push forward, you hit a minefield, so you steer your column to the right, finding what looks like a gap in the defenses. You push your vehicles into this gap. You think you are making a breakthrough, and then the trap snaps shut. FPV drones swarm from the sky, disabling the lead and rear vehicles, trapping your entire column in the mud. And before you can even radio for help, the coordinates of your exact location are relayed to the 52nd Artillery Brigade miles away. The 13-man crew of an M110 loads an M106 high-explosive shell. They set the elevation. They lock the hydraulics. They pull the cord. 2 minutes later, a 200-pound piece of American steel falls from the stratosphere directly onto the trapped convoy. The resulting explosion leaves nothing but burning craters and twisted, unidentifiable scrap metal. This is the reality of the Ukrainian kill zone, and the M110 has made it exponentially more lethal. The terror for Russia doesn't end with this initial batch of 60 guns. If the intelligence from military analysts holds true, Greece has up to 85 more of these massive M110 howitzers sitting in their reserve stockpiles. If the initial deployment continues to yield these catastrophic results against the Russian offensive, you can guarantee that diplomats are already working behind closed doors to secure the rest of the Greek inventory. But the real shadow hanging over Vladimir Putin is the United States. The M110 is an American-born weapon. The United States produced over 1,100 of these machines during the Cold War. The ultimate question is, where are they now? We know that during the 1990s, after the weapon was retired, the American military repurposed many of the M110's massive gun barrels. They took those thick, indestructible tubes of steel, packed them with high explosives, and turned them into the legendary GBU-28 bunker-busting bombs used during the Gulf War to penetrate deep underground Iraqi command centers. But what happened to the chassis? What happened to the hydraulic systems, the tracks, the engines? Are there hundreds of deactivated M110s sitting under tarps in the boneyards of the Nevada desert? And if there are, could Ukraine get them? The mechanism to make it happen already exists. It is called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL. This is a brilliant initiative that allows NATO nations to fund the direct purchase of specific weapons from American stockpiles on behalf of Ukraine. Instead of allies just sending whatever spare parts they have lying around, Ukraine gets to look at the menu, point to exactly what they need, and have their allies write the check to the American defense industry to pull it out of storage and ship it to the front. NATO allies have already funneled over $4 billion through the PEARL program. If Ukraine decides that the M110 is the ultimate key to breaking the Russian meat assaults, they could use this program to resurrect the ghosts of the American Cold War arsenal. Even if the original barrels were used for bunker busters, the European defense industry, particularly the Czech initiative, has proven incredibly adept at manufacturing replacement parts and retrofitting old gear. We could see a massive revival program where dormant American M110 hulls are fitted with brand new, freshly forged European barrels, creating an endless supply of heavy artillery for the Ukrainian front. This weapon represents a beautiful, violent irony. Vladimir Putin launched this invasion under the delusion of restoring the glory of the Soviet Empire. He is fighting this war using the exact same brutal, uncaring meat grinder tactics that the Soviet Union used in the 20th century. He is relying on mass over maneuver, volume over precision, and fear over tactics. And in response, Ukraine has reached back into the 20th century and pulled out the exact weapon the United States designed specifically to destroy massive Soviet formations. The M110 was built for one purpose: to stare down the barrel of a Russian armored wave and turn it to ash. It waded through the Vietnam War, it waded through the tension of the 1980s, it went to sleep in the 1990s, and now in the frozen mud of the Donbass, it has finally woken up to fulfill its original destiny. Ukraine is not just taking these old weapons and using them as they were. The Ukrainian military is famous for its MacGyver-like ability to take Western equipment and push it far beyond its original design limits. We have seen them take American Bradley fighting vehicles and use them to blind and destroy top-of-the-line Russian T-90 tanks. We have seen them take M1 Abrams tanks and coat them in specialized explosive reactive armor, creating hybrid beasts that the Pentagon never even imagined. You can absolutely guarantee that Ukrainian engineers are already looking at the M110 and figuring out how to make it deadlier. They will mount electronic warfare jammers on the chassis to protect them from Russian drones. They will integrate the targeting systems with Starlink, feeding real-time drone coordinates directly to the gun crews to eliminate the need for forward observers. They will take a 1960s American brute and hardwire it into the deadliest digitized kill chain the world has ever seen.